This is the story of the United Nations' successful fight against aggression during 1 year in Korea. When, on June 25, 1950, the North Korean Communists attacked the Republic of Korea without warning or justification, one of history's most important questions faced the world. Would free nations, under the flag of the United Nations, band together to halt that aggression? The first year in Korea has provided the answer. With men and materiel, the free nations have proven that they will. The opening phase of the UN battle was one of retreat. The first United Nations troops were hopelessly outnumbered and outarmed. Their mission was to delay the enemy's advance in a desperate fight for time for men and guns to arrive over the long supply routes from the free nations of the world. And so through July and August 1950, the UN forces fell back, yielding space to buy time. As the fighting men retreated, long lines of Korean civilians moved south with them. Rather than live under the tyranny of communism, these refugees gave up their homes to trudge mile after weary mile. Some from north of the 38th parallel had already tasted red rule. For them, the outbreak of hostilities had provided a long-sought opportunity to flee south. Korea's isolated position, far from the free world sources of supply, gave the Reds the initial advantage. They had prepared long for their sneak attack. Now, before them, the UN troops retreated slowly and by plan to the Pusan perimeter, far south of the capital of Seoul. Here, in a circle ringing the important port of Pusan, the United Nations forces held fast. At Pusan, the UN forces had to stand firm or be pushed off the Korean peninsula. They stood firm. Behind the defending ring of troops, reinforcements were pouring into the port of Pusan. Soldiers from many lands who had traveled thousands of miles to fight for the right of a distant nation to remain free. Supplies from many of the UN member nations were arriving too. Each hour of precious time gained was used in building strength for a counteroffensive. At the battlefront, religious services were held for the men whose heroism had bought that time. Now, slowly, the tide of battle turned. Here a few yards, here a few miles, the UN forces began to press forward. For the first time, the United Nations were on the offensive in Korea. In less than 3 months, despite a tremendous supply problem, free nations working in concert had assembled a force sufficient to meet a well-equipped aggressor and turn him back. The UN flag flew in towns occupied hours before by the Reds. The liberation of the Republic of Korea was underway. From the Pusan perimeter, the attacking United Nations forces fanned out in an ever-widening arc. Suddenly, a new surprise UN offensive was launched in the north at Incheon, 150 miles behind the back of the North Korean Communist Army. Navy guns opened the assault. At dawn, the first waves of troops came ashore to secure the United Nations' new second front in Korea. The date was September 15, 1950. The North Korean communists were caught in a giant nutcracker formed by the UN forces in the north and the UN forces in the south. The closing of that nutcracker brought Red resistance in the Republic of Korea virtually to an end. Seoul was liberated in fierce street-to-street fighting. This capital city, once with a population of 1,500,000 persons, had suffered terribly during its brief period under communist rule. It became the first national capital since World War II to be wrested from the hands of a Red invader. Working under sniper fire, well-equipped medical units cared for casualties. Wounded United Nations soldiers and wounded Korean civilians received equal attention. Blood plasma, donated by free people thousands of miles away, saved many soldier and civilian lives. Troops of the Republic of Korea proudly carried their flag back to the liberated capital of Seoul. As the UN closed the gap between its forces in the north and south, the total of communist troops captured rose at a rapid rate. Of the once mighty North Korean army of 150,000 men, almost three-quarters was wiped out. One of the big tasks begun immediately in the United Nations was the feeding of the Republic of Korea's civilian population, which had faced starvation during the communist occupation. Thousands of tons of rice, much of it donated by the UN member nation of Thailand, brought new strength and hope to these victims of Red aggression. Clothing was also distributed to the Koreans, and the young were not overlooked. Warm garments like these might mean the difference between life and death in the cold winter ahead. As the communists retreated, they left behind them grim remains, atrocities committed as a grisly gesture of vengeance during the last days of Red rule. At Cheonju alone, 1,500 men, women, and children were murdered by the enemy. Vast quantities of weapons used by the North Korean Reds were captured, weapons made in Russia. That the USSR had been supplying an aggressor was now proven beyond the shadow of a doubt for all the world to see. The date of manufacture, 1950, indicates how recently some of this equipment had come from the Soviet Union. In the United Nations Security Council, United States Representative Warren showed one of the Russian-made guns captured in Korea. Soviet Representative Jacob Malik didn't wait to look. He walked out. The other United Nations delegates, however, examined the exhibit, passing it along the Security Council table. Britain, Sir Gladwin Jebb, closely studied the gun, produced in a Russian factory just a short time before. The exhibit was passed across Malik's empty chair to the representative from Norway. But Soviet aid failed to bring victory to the North Korean communists. By September 1950, the forces of the United Nations had swept to the 38th parallel. Speaker planes were used to appeal to the fleeing communists. The voice of the UN was carried to the Reds below by powerful amplifiers. Every effort was made to bring the action in Korea to an end without further bloodshed. Safe conduct passes rained from the sky. Many North Korean Reds grasped this opportunity to surrender. On October 1st, troops of the Republic of Korea became the first United Nations force to cross the 38th parallel in pursuit of the North Korean Communist Army. Soon the UN was moving across the 38th parallel in force. On the other side were Koreans who had been living under the control of communism since the end of the Second World War. Yet they cheered on the advancing UN forces, hailing them as liberators. These civilians were jubilant at their release from years of red domination. The UN forces pushed swiftly forward. By October 27, 1950, ROK troops had reached the Yalu River. In 4 months, the United Nations had forged what seemed certain victory in Korea. In their advance from the 38th parallel to the Yalu, the UN forces had met fierce pockets of resistance. In some sectors, they had even been forced to retreat temporarily. These films of one small skirmish in one small sector of the front convey some of the feeling of combat and of individual heroism. United Nations air power had played an important role in the entire offensive from the Pusan perimeter to the Manchurian border. On October 31st, as other UN forces neared the Yalu, disturbing news was heard. A unit from Communist China was reported in action. It was known that a large concentration of Chinese Red troops was grouped behind the Manchurian border. The UN forces dug in and waited. On November 3rd, 1950, the Chinese Communists swept down from Manchuria in force. The battle against the North Korean aggressors had been won, but this was a new aggression, a new battle in which the troops of the United Nations were again hopelessly outnumbered. Rear guard actions held off the Chinese Reds as in 20 below zero cold, the UN forces began their retreat. By their unannounced and unwarranted attack, the Chinese Communists, 200,000 strong, hoped to trap the UN forces. This was not to be. The UN troops fell back, not in confusion, but in complete order, taking a terrible toll of the enemy with every mile. The UN wounded were evacuated by air. Along with their wounded soldiers, the UN forces evacuated wounded Korean civilians. Down the frozen Korean peninsula, the retreat continued as the Chinese Reds, now numbering 1 million, pushed relentlessly on. Their aim was to destroy the entire UN army by the force of vastly superior numbers. But they had not reckoned upon the strength, purpose, and courage of free men. Moving with the retreat were hundreds of thousands of refugees, North Koreans willing to chance the long, hard trek south rather than live again under the communists. Even in retreat, the humane work of the UN went on. Korean orphans, innocent victims of the conflict, were loaded aboard planes. Their destination was a United Nations island sanctuary, far from the battlefront, where they would find shelter, food, clothing, and safety. Meanwhile, at the port of Hungnam, 20,000 United States Marines who had blasted their way through 100,000 fanatically led Chinese communists were evacuated by sea. Under a protective cover of fire, a huge rescue fleet carried them to safety. Although the Chinese Reds were pressing down from the hills around the city, the evacuation of United Nations troops proceeded in orderly fashion. Men and equipment were loaded rapidly. The well-planned operation at Hungnam marked the complete and final failure of the Red effort to annihilate the UN army. The retreat continued. Then the Chinese communists, their supply lines overextended and under constant aerial bombardment, were forced to halt. During Red China's advance, Communist General Wu had appeared before the United Nations to defy the free world. United States Delegate Austin warned, General Wu went very far to show that his hand is against all men's. Let him give heed, lest he go home from this place with all men's hands against him. The truth of this statement is evidenced in Korea today by this Danish medical unit, by this field ambulance unit from India, part of the international force working for victory under the United Nations, by this hospital unit from the Netherlands, and a like unit from Sweden, by these newly arrived troops from Ethiopia, natives of a land once wantonly invaded. The Ethiopians understand well what aggression means and the necessity of fighting for freedom. By troops from Colombia, now on the way, and by troops already on the fighting front. From Great Britain, from Canada, from France, from Turkey, from Belgium, Luxembourg, from the United States, from Thailand, from Australia, from New Zealand, from Greece, from the Philippines, and troops of the Republic of Korea valiantly defending their homeland. Free men all, fighting for freedom. For the second time in Korea, this great international army was able to resume the offensive. Once more, the UN advanced above the 38th parallel. Communist China's answer was to launch 2 assaults, the greatest of the Korean battle. Against this ruthless sacrifice of human life was pitted the skill and determination of the United Nations troops. The assault was stopped, then turned back. The UN continued to push forward under General Ridgway, who on April 11 had assumed command from General MacArthur to become United Nations Supreme Commander. As 1 year of UN effort drew to a close in Korea, the word from the front remained, advance. The bag of prisoners was growing more and more rapidly. These men had been told by their communist leaders that capture by UN troops meant certain death. Instead, they were well treated, receiving comparable food and clothing and the same medical care as United Nations troops. Today, in battered Seoul, twice overrun by a communist invader, can be found the spirit that keeps men free. When United Nations forces entered to liberate the Republic of Korea's capital from the Red Chinese, civilians emerged from the ruins to greet them with unbounded joy. The Communist Victory Arch, symbol of aggression and tyranny, went down in Seoul. In its place rose the flag of the United Nations. In this battle for freedom, we of the United Nations have paid a price. But these men have not died in vain. For during 1 year in Korea, the United Nations have proven that free men will rise together to fight an aggressor no matter where he may strike. And as long as this is so, the cause of freedom cannot perish from the earth.
Thank you. 고맙습니다.